Real quick, I want to give you guys a book recommendation. Jeremiah Johnson is a really great apologist. He teaches, I believe, at Houston Baptist University, I think is where he teaches. But he's a good scholar and thinker and writer. He wrote a book called Unimaginable. I've quoted this book in the past. It doesn't have pictures. I know, what am I thinking? But it's short. It's, I think, less than 200 pages. It's a really, really good primer. This is what would you call a primer into the impact of Christianity on the world. And it really does a really fair job, goes to primary sources, looks at them, and shows you a lot of the influence. We're going to be talking about a few things out of his work and a couple other guys, Rodney Stark, Alvin Schmidt. These are guys who've done a lot of work in this area of what would happen if Christianity never existed. Right? So, in history, they call these counterfactuals. A counterfactual is what would have happened if, Hitler didn't try to go into Russia in the winter, right? Historians like to play these things out. They're called counterfactuals of history. And this is a bit of it's not really a counterfactual, but it does show the direct influence, not what would have happened if not necessarily, but what did happen because this did happen. Does that make sense? Right? So terrific little book, and he's got a good bibliography in the back if you guys want to look at some more resources about that. But I tend to view this as one of the stronger points as to why I believe in the Judeo-Christian worldview because of its impact. And you're going to see why I'm saying that, because we're about to get into the social context now of everything we've done. Now we're getting into the family, we're going to get into business, into our money, and you're going to see now Paul says, if chapter 1 is true, if Christ is who he says he is, and chapter 2, if he's better than everything the world has to offer, like there's nothing that can do what Christ can do, then chapter 3 must take effect. It has to affect our lives. Not because we are duty bound, because we are a bunch of moralists, but because we are followers of Christ and we are lovers of God. That's why. We are lovers of God. And when you're lovers of God, you now want your life to look a certain way. You don't want to live a cheap faith. You want to live an authentic faith, right? And so, or a word that Paul uses is sincere, a sincere faith. You guys may have heard me talk about this. A sincere faith is what's known as a sun-tested faith. Remember that? Heliokrene, sun-tested. And it was this idea that if people made some pottery and they went cheap with it, it was a cheap pottery. If there was cracks in it, they would put wax in the cracks. Remember? They put wax in the cracks. And then what you'd have to do in the market to make sure there's no cracks is do what? Hold it up to the sun to see if you can see wax in the cracks. And if there was cracks, you knew the guy went cheap. But if there was no cracks, you knew it was sun tested. And that's the word that we get for sincere. A sincere person is one who has been tested, and there are no wax in the cracks. Hang on one second. Hey guys, if you have not put your thing on mute, would you do that for me? Because I'm having a hard time. Thank you. All right. Good. So I want you to look here where, if you noticed in the very end of verse 17, right here, Paul says, and whatever you do in word or in deed, do everything in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks to God the Father through him. This is an important phrase because basically what he's saying is, Paul is saying, everything that we do, Christ should be the one that controls our impulses. It's been said that civilization, tell me what this means. Civilization was the ability to contain negative emotion. What does that mean? Civilization was the ability of mankind to contain negative emotion. What's that mean? Buddy, what do you think?
I think it means that if it wasn't for the social norms and the desire to continue living, you better contain your emotions, otherwise we'd all be dead because we would have killed each other.
Bingo. That's
pretty quick.
Doesn't take long to go back to look at the barbaric periods of human history, does it? Just to see how absolutely horrific and awful they could be to human beings, to their enemies, to each other. And when you began to teach this idea of containing negative emotion, which, by the way, that is the definition of maturity. I don't know if you know that or not. All right. How do children handle negative emotion? Hey, Adam, you teach a bunch of high school kids. They're not quite adults yet. How well do they handle negative emotion?
Not great.
Man, it is uncontained, right? And the job of a parent is to create an environment such that that negative emotion is contained and redirected in a positive or constructive manner, right? That's called maturity. Can you be 40 years old, can you be 50 years old and still have a short temper? Can you? Can you be 50 years old and still cut people out of your life because they made you mad? Can that happen? Sure, of course it can happen. Can you be 50 years old and still somebody cuts you off out on the road and that nice little sign language shows up in your hand? Like that happened to me this morning. Yes, there's people all around. Every day we go and you see the inability to contain negative emotion. And what Christianity has done, it has come on the scene and has provided a context through the power of the Holy Spirit in Christ to give us a way to manage these impulses that all human beings have. We could go around the room right now and all name a negative emotion we've all felt this week. Couldn't we? We've all felt them. And so the ability to contain it is important. We're about to go into a social dynamic now with the family. And there are all kinds of negative emotions that can surface. Have y'all experienced that yet, just out of curiosity? Any negative emotions in the home? Absolutely. And so notice here in the very first verse, right after Paul says, whatever you do in word or deed, do everything in the name of the Lord Jesus. In other words, let's make sure we're containing this negative emotion and let's do what we do in a manner that is worthy of the Lord. And it will be not a matter of willpower, but about a matter of His power in our lives, if we submit to it. And so he says, wives, starts off there, submit yourselves to your husbands. Not an imperative, this is in the middle voice. It's basically saying to wives, make the choice to submit yourselves. He's not hitting the wives hard and saying, you submit, women. He's saying, submit yourselves. There's something that's good about this. Now, make a point in Ephesians 5. Paul uses very similar language and says, husbands and wives, submit to one another. To one another. Paul isn't coming in as some oppressive patriarch coming in and making sure women are in their place. What he's saying is, listen, there's something about submission that's beautiful. What is it about submission in the Christian worldview that's beautiful? What does it show? What does submission show? Humility. It shows humility. Who said that? Gold star right there. Okay, you get that. That's good. Shows humility. Because what do I have to do in order to show submission? Why does it show humility? What am I laying aside, Britt? Your flesh. Your pride, you're having to lay that aside. Is that tough to do, by the way? To lay your pride and your flesh aside for the sake of another? Yes, so it takes humility. What else does it take? What's that? Honor. It's a form of honor, that you are elevating someone else, even if they don't necessarily deserve it, right? They deserve it by virtue of the fact that they are made in the image of God and they deserve to be treated in a certain way. True? Go back to Adam again. Adam, you got a bunch of young kids in your class. Some can be disruptive, I'm assuming. Are they in the image of God? Most likely. I'm sure some days you wonder. Yeah. Do they still deserve to be treated with respect? 100%. It's so easy as an adult to want to lash out or put them in their place in some sort of authoritative manner, which I'm not saying there's not a role for authority, but it has to be done with a sense of dignity and respect. That is what civilization does, and that is the hallmark of Christian civilization, is that we view one another in a very particular light. It doesn't take long when you begin to look at the research in the past to see that in the ancient days, women were not esteemed very highly. They had second-tier rights. And whether you came from a Hellenic or a Greek background or a Roman background, you were both, in a sense, marginalized as women compared to men. If you were a Roman woman, your father or your brothers could actually demand your divorce to your husband if they got mad at him. They could file divorce for you. You had no rights in your own divorce. There was a lot of rights in the Greco-Roman world that really put women in a very marginalized place. Not completely. There were certain women, obviously, who were very wealthy in the Greco-Roman world if they were born into that world. But they were a marginalized people. It's one reason why Christianity early on was a religion of women. And you go to Romans 16, Paul mentions I think there's 18 people or 20 people mentioned. 12 of them are women. He leads with women as the ones who are leaders and people of faith in the early church. And so we need to recognize that the Bible really elevates women. It goes all the way back to Genesis 1:26, that women are made in the image of God. In the image of God, male and female, He made them. There is an ontological equality among men and women. So when you talk about wives, submit yourselves to your husbands, it's not in this patriarchal sense of male dominance. It's in the sense that there's something beautiful about submission. Have you ever been, guys, in a disagreement with maybe your spouse or a partner or whatever, and you willingly chose to just let it go, just to concede it, not just for peace, but because you love them. Not because, listen, okay, fine, I don't want to fight anymore. No, it's because in that moment, you realize, I love this person so much that I don't want to fight about it. This isn't important to me. Let's do what you want to do. It's fine. You ever been there?
It's one time.
Britt says one time. How did that one time go?
But it gets to the point where it's just not worth it.
To give in? No, I'm kidding.
To fight.
Yeah.
It's just not worth it. In turmoil, and then it creates this, well, I'm going to win this, or you're going to win this battle, and then next thing you know, you're carrying it on into the rest of your day, and it's just not worth it.
Yeah.
I mean, the calm and the peace and doing all things, and I found it ironic how this verse then is repeated over a little bit later, but whatever you do your word and deed.
Yeah.
And then it starts off, husbands, wives, submit.
Right.
I mean, it's like, there's a reason why.
Yeah. We are called to peace. That's right. Right. And so I want you guys to recognize the point that I'm making here is that there's something beautiful about the role of submission. Now, does Paul have a headship model where he sees creation as the model? He sees the Trinity as the model of Father, Son, Holy Spirit, Father, man, God, man, woman. Yes, there is a order in creation, but within that there is a mutual submission within that order. There is no domination in the order. It's a beautiful thing. And it's something that Jesus loved, submitting to the Father. There was something honoring and humbling and beautiful about that, particularly when you can submit to that which you can trust. That's the point. So as men now, we want to make it as easy as possible. So we get a verse 2. Right? What's our verse? He says, husbands, love your wives and don't be bitter toward them. Interesting phrase that Paul uses here. Don't be bitter toward them. What is it that leads a man towards being bitter towards his partner, his spouse, his wife? What is it that leads a man to be bitter? Think about this. Nick, what do you think? What leads to bitterness?
Unforgiveness.
Yes, that's exactly right. It's a harboring, isn't it? And it's this harboring you hold on to, and as it grows over time, it accentuates itself into a bitterness because you've not. So this man that becomes bitter towards his wife, what has he failed to do over time? What's that? Love her. He's failed to love her. He's failed to forgive her. He's failed to be kind to her. He's failed to listen to her. And so he's told here to love her, right? And the idea is that there is a sense where you are so wonderful, so good, you are so God's child, you are so in his image, that I'm called to love you in this way and not be embittered. Now, this is a high call, because in the home, how easy is it for negative emotions to creep in? I mean, it can happen over the smallest things sometimes. Isn't that true? The smallest things can suddenly, where did that come from? And the reality is that we have to be people who put on the mind of Christ, right? We have to be able to do all things that are worthy of him. And man, I'll tell you, I'm the first guy to fail at this. It's an area that God continues to work in my heart and trying to be even more patient and more loving and listening more and being slower to speak and quicker to listen, right? This is an area of my own sanctification with Stacy, and just trying to continue to be that man that loves her in such a way that she's able to more easily choose the first part of that, which is to kind of go with me also. See? Mike, did you have a comment?
Yeah, well, question, what is the word for love in Greek in this verse?
Agape. Yeah. Yep. So it's a pretty common word. I think sometimes people might use this word in terms of it's this unconditional love, no matter what, right? It is that. That is the context of agape. It's also a sense of a loyal love. It's a loyal love that exists. And so because I'm loyal to this individual, I will love you with all that I have, because I'm committed to you, right? God's love isn't merely unconditional. It's a loyal love. He's with us. He will never leave us or abandon us or forsake us, right? Is that true? See, that's an agape love. It's a loyal, dedicated love. I will treat you with the loyalty that you deserve. Not to say there's not an unconditional nature to it, but to make it a little bit more human, I can understand loyal love a lot easier than I can understand unconditional love. Because unconditional love is so difficult sometimes as human beings, because we're very conditional creatures. But I can practice a loyal love. Right? Any more comments on that? You got to understand the revolutionary nature of these two verses right here in the home of what now Paul has done. Rodney Stark, probably one of the greatest Christian sociologists today. I think he's at Baylor. He wrote a wonderful book, a little bit dated today, but it's a great book called The Triumph of Christianity. And in this, he shows from all the statistics and the numbers that we have, he shows how the rapid growth of the early church was predominantly by women. Something like between 240 AD and 450 AD, that 200 and so year period of time, and the highest of the Roman Senate, 85% of the women who were in the Roman Senate world were Christians. 85% by that time. 50% were men. In fact, women, Stark makes the argument, who came to become followers of Christ in the first, second, third centuries, they were the ones that were strategic, that would then go to their husbands, and they would then begin to reflect and represent and speak of Christ and their faith. And it was the wives, it was the women who had the impact into the highest courts, the highest imperial courts, and many would come to faith because of the women, because of wives. It was very strategic how that worked. Right? And you see Paul talk about this, about how women can do what for their unbelieving husbands. Remember? What's the word he uses? Sanctify. Right? There's an effect that the woman has, the wife can have over her unbelieving husband. That's what was happening. And Paul recognizes that. It's very strategic. And why do you think women were drawn to Christ and to Christianity early on?
The culture was so oppressive.
Because they lived in an oppressive, marginalized culture. So one, they were viewed more highly and esteemed higher. What else?
Jesus' tenderness towards women.
That's great. Jesus' tenderness towards women. You just look at the stories and the way Jesus treated the weakest among us. Children. A woman's heart for her children. Male and female. See, in the Greco-Roman world, if you were born a little girl, you had probably a 30 to 40% chance of being pitched out over the fence, over the wall, to be consumed by dogs because you provided no value to that family. You can still dig up ancient drainage systems, and you can find the bones of little girls that were just thrown away, discarded. It was just a barbaric view of the weak back then. Right? So you look at the way Christianity has spread throughout the world and its view of women and children. A lot of practices around the world have been stopped because of Christian missionary efforts to go in and overturn these human rights violations. The whole concept of human rights comes out of a Judeo-Christian worldview. The whole concept of just war theory comes out of the Judeo-Christian worldview, this idea that when you go to war, there's got to be a compensatory, there's got to be a sense that you don't overdo it. You don't go indiscriminately kill. You kill one of mine, I'm going to kill 10 of yours. That's not just war theory. If we're going to go drop a bomb, what do we try to do the best we can before we drop a bomb?
Target accurately.
Let people know. Target accurately. Make sure there's no collateral damage in the area. We spend all of this time and energy and money making sure that this drop is going to be proportionate to the crime that we're trying to pronounce judgment on. We don't just indiscriminately just carpet bomb and kill everything around. Whereas you don't have to go far in the world today to look at indiscriminate bombing. And it's almost always places where the church or Christianity has no role or place in that society. It's violent. Right? So this is transformational of what Paul is doing right here. Men and women.
Hey, Walt, is it just me, or does this verse, it hits me weird because it's like Paul's assuming that women are going to cause problems. It's like women be subject to men. Don't be mad at them all the time.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
that's what it kind of reflects as.
Yeah. Well, unless you saw it another way, Chad, right? Maybe men, you have such a problem with not containing negative emotion that you're just bitter people. So maybe it's not because the women are a problem. Maybe it's because the men are the problem, and men are quick to anger. You may not be, but men are quick to anger. Men are quick to being impatient. Quit being bitter. Practice forgiveness. Be humble, right? That's probably more the approach as opposed to, I know men, it's so tough living with these women. Yeah, I don't think that's the way he's doing it. Yeah.
Well, I also think Paul knows how men are, like you were just saying, how simple we are. We need specific instructions. So he's telling them women need love, not, other places where it says men, wives respect their husbands, men love your wives.
Yeah.
So that's the need that they respond to.
Yeah.
We want the respect, we love them, right? So
Right.
Paul's telling you,
I think what
you're going to miss this, so let me spell it out.
Yeah, he needed to spell it out. But I think you're right. One commentator I read, he said, it wasn't enough for Paul to just say, love your wives. Because most guys would be like, yeah. Okay, love your wives. And he's like, let me give you an example. Quit being bitter. All right, well, what's it take to quit being bitter? Oh man, now I've got to be humble. I've got to honor this person. I've got to go ask their forgiveness, right? Earlier, Paul talks about mutual submission. It's big to not be bitter. It's tough for guys. We're not talking about carrying bitterness for days. We're talking about in the moment. Don't even be bitter in the moment, right? Be that kind of a man. How hard is that to not be bitter about things? Yeah. So a lot could be packed into this thing, right? But we got to keep moving. But you guys get the point. So then he goes on and he says, children, obey your parents in everything. Now, this is an interesting phrase. Now, the children, obviously, he's writing to here are children of people parents who've probably come out of a pagan context into the Christian worldview. And he's saying, listen to them. And the reason is very simple. What is the primary reason a child should listen to their parents? This isn't rocket science here. What is the primary reason you would tell a child, listen to your parents and everything that they say? At some point, you'll get to think for yourself, but there's a period of time to listen to your parents. What's that?
For their own good.
One more time.
For their own good.
It's for their own good.
Guidance, direction.
That's it. It's guidance and direction. See, as a child, we know this. Today, we know it more than ever. There is a immaturity in the emotional development and the neurological development and wisdom. There's an undevelopment of that in a child. They're dependent on the wisdom and the insight and the protection of their parents. Listen to them. You will get to make your choices someday. Take what you can from them. Now, this is just one verse. Let's not go to the extremes. Are you saying, no, I'm not saying that. Okay? We're not talking about the extremes on the outliers of abusive parenting. We're talking about the role that a parent plays in a child's life, right? And that the child is the one that should glean from the parents, not the parents trying to glean from the child. And then he says, verse 21, fathers, do not exasperate your children so that they won't become discouraged. Is it easy for a father to exasperate his children? Yes. Why? What is it about a father that can easily exasperate the child? I mean, this is to fathers. This isn't to parents, specifically to fathers. What is it that a father can do that can exasperate their child?
Giving too much guidance and direction.
Yeah, not allowing the child to have enough autonomy sometimes, right? Too much control, too much guidance. That's good. What else?
Overpraise.
Over what?
Overpraise.
Overpraise. Now this leads to exasperating, right? So the child gets angry. I'm not sure how many children get mad over too much praise. All right? You can do too much praise, but in this context, what is it the fathers are doing to anger their child?
I think having unrealistic expectations that they should be further along than they are. You know, you expect them to be able to do what you can do, and when they don't, you get all like, why didn't you? You know, like, I just told you what to, you know.
Right.
And once you wake up from blowing the gasket, you realize it's not. It's just being patient with them and letting them fail constructively.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's right.
With grace.
With grace, yeah. Russ?
So some other versions use embitter and provoke instead of exasperate.
Yeah.
And so I think it's Chandler, somebody's spoken on this a lot, where they say, like, look, you just don't yell at your kids. You can't yell at your kids, you can't be mean to them. And I think that's a lot of what he's talking about here, like fathers being like too overbearing on their children. It could be, from expectations or just from a disciplinary standpoint, that sort of thing. And so, like, if you discipline your child over and over and over again too harshly,
right.
One of two things ends up happening. You end up having kind of the beaten puppy syndrome, where they cower away or they rebel. Right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a big part of this where I think fathers a lot of times live out of the image of themselves, and the child reflects the father. And there's a part of it that's very natural. As the father, so the child shall be, is kind of the idea. And so when the child does something that doesn't reflect what the father wants, in fact, maybe he's embarrassed, or maybe he feels like the child should be further along, it's easy now to lead that child to anger by being too hard on that child also. Nick?
Yeah, like my version says, fathers, do not embitter your children or they will become discouraged.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that, like, typically in the father role, like, there's, I think, a stereotype that, like, a father is not emotionally attuned to a child or their inner life, and that seems to be what this verse is speaking of. Is like, can the father be attuned to what's happening in his child's internal world so that he can know what's going to embitter my child and what is actually, like, when they feel discouraged. I think that's a cool point that he makes, and it's like, that's even like the science and like attachment theory. It's like, to the degree that the parental figure is attuned to what the child is experiencing, do they develop emotionally and neurologically? And
yeah, I think that's a really a great insight that you saw in the text, is that you actually see in the New Testament that caring for your child's feelings is important. Whereas if you look in the ancient world so much, the child's feelings probably didn't really play that strong a role. It's irrelevant what you feel. And so in this, it's talking about, no, the child's feelings do matter, because what is the child in the Christian worldview? The child is in the image of God. This child matters. It has as much dignity as the father, right? It could easily say there's neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor freeman, male nor female, young or old. I mean, you could add that on there, because they're all in Christ. They're all in the image of God, right? They're all one in Christ Jesus in that sense. And so I think what you're saying is absolutely right, Nick, that this idea of taking interest in how is my child feeling. Problem is, if you're an adult male who's not in touch with your own feelings, it's very difficult to be in touch with the feelings of others, because you're not even in touch with your own. So it's a good insight. Yeah, Kev? Kevin? Sorry.
About a year ago, my son and I, we were having some deep dive conversations.
Mm-hmm.
And we used to work and do projects together, and then we didn't anymore. I asked him why. And he says, every time we do, we always get in a fight. And I go, okay. He says, you always tell me what to do. And then you go back and redo it.
Yeah.
And I reflected on that, and I go back to my father, because my father, when I would do things, my father then would point things out that I was doing, but then he would go back and redo it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I share this with you guys because this morning was a great time with my son, because we sit there and we just talk.
Yeah.
We just talk now. So I say this because there's a lot of this do as I say, not as I do type of thing.
Yeah.
But when you've got your adult son looking at you in your eyes, and he's telling you, he says, you're full of pride. What do you say?
Yeah. It's good. Thanks for sharing
Then
that.
you have to come back and reflect
Yeah.
that the pride in each and every one of us
Yeah.
is strong. And if we don't allow some of these other characteristics and attributes,
Yeah.
humility, come into play, then
That's good. That's good, Kevin. Thank you, buddy.
exasperation.
John Ball, do you have a comment?
Yeah, time is a void that's filled with something, and if fatherhood is just all that you can't do and yelling and just totally just boundaries, what can they do? And can they do it with their dad?
Right.
And so as you're learning how God's made them, and you are submissive too. It's like, well, maybe he's not into sports, but he's
Yeah.
into electronics or something like that, and you go with them. That's the other thing. It's exasperating if everything a dad is don'ts,
Yeah.
and you're not involved in what you can do.
Right.
What is this kid going to do then if you've got all these things they can't do constantly?
Yeah. I think and we're going to keep moving on this, I think the old principle that the way to ruin a child is to have too many yeses and too many nos. That there has to be a balance and a wisdom between the two. Can no be an important word for a child, even when you could say yes? Because what does that force a child to have to do when they hear no?
Discipline.
Self-discipline, manage themselves, manage their emotions, manage the disappointment. It's an important word. Can you say no too much? You can embitter the child. You can discourage the child. Can you say yes too much? Can there be a father that just wants to give their child everything and never said yes? And now the child never learns to manage necessarily the challenges and the difficulties, right, of managing those negative emotions. So it really requires a lot of wisdom here. I do like Nick's point back there that he made. I thought that's a really good insight about the importance, how Paul actually recognizes the feelings of a child. Okay, I think that's a really great insight there, Nick, that you saw. So thank you for sharing that one in particular. Let's keep going. Then he goes now, verse 23, slaves, obey your human masters in everything. Don't work only while being watched as people pleasers, but work wholeheartedly, fearing the Lord. Now we could spend just an entire session just on this concept here of what does it mean to be a slave, a doulos, literally a servant. And within Judaism, as many of you know, there was a very important concept that was the indentured servant. that you would a lot of times work off your debt by serving someone else to work off a debt. Or you were not able to provide for yourself, so you would sell yourself to someone to be their servant, their doulos. You're their slave, and you would now work for them. It was not biblical slavery, and the word that word is almost a jolting word to us, and should be because of our own history and experience of what slavery was. It was not the chattel slavery that we understand it to be from American history and from some of the history around the world. This was a different form. Now, were there conditions that were put on those who were responsible for their doulos, for their slaves, for those who were their servants? Yes, they had very specific commandments on how to treat them. In fact, you get an entire book in the New Testament that basically is a strong appeal, not quite a command, but a very strong appeal to free your doulos, free your slave. Let him go now from his duties and his debts. What book is that? Philemon. And Paul basically says to him, let Onesimus go. I'm not commanding you, but as your spiritual father, I'm twisting your arm. Right? We are here for freedom. Set him free. See? And so what I love about the biblical understanding of this very, very deeply rooted human practice is that the New Testament in particular is what I call a pledge to the future. It's a little bit like, if I can put it this way, the Constitution is a document that is a pledge to the future. They were not able in that generation to rectify all the social wrongs and ills that were a part of their generation. They were just trying to survive and start a new nation. It was tough enough to find independence from a tyrannical power like England, coming here and trying to establish common law and an ordered society. But they built into their document, a pledge to the future that all men, are created equal. And all men have these inalienable rights that are built into them. And that these early founders believed and hoped that future generations would rectify the wrongs of a society and of a world that did not recognize that powerful and beautiful truth, that all men are created equal. And it was done in 85 years. In 85 years, it was legally eradicated. Slavery was done in America in 85 years from its inception as the founding of a country. That is unheard of. That is called a pledge to the future, leveraging a document that establishes the core value of a new nation. See my point? In the same way, the New Testament teaches us. It didn't come to overturn the entire social order of its world. It came and told you how to treat people within the social order of that world. So if you are a slave, you work hard as unto the Lord. This is not your final home. He didn't say run and flee. He said you serve humbly before God, not being a people pleaser, but you give your best. You reflect as a Christian servant the best of what it means to be a Christian servant. And if you're a master, you treat them well. And if you can set them free, set them free. But you treat them well, for they are your brother, they are your sister. See? It's a beautiful document. What's happened is people have bastardized the notion of slavery from a biblical perspective. It actually was a pledge to the future for the freedom of all people. So now we move on. Any comments on that, by the way? That's a big topic right there. I don't want to just kind of jump over it. Anybody have a comment to make about that? Are you good?
There's still a fit to employer-employee, even though we don't see ourselves slaves. We've endeared ourselves that they're going to supply us with the income we want.
Yeah.
So there's value in seeing those principles,
yeah,
how to be a good employee.
That's right. Well, in one sense, John, I mean, you're right, but in one sense, even an employee is an indentured servant. You are offering your services in exchange for something else, right? Just like the ancient world oftentimes, you would give yourself over for provision, for debt to be taken care of, to have provision for your family. In the same way, when I go and work for someone, I don't just work hard when the boss walks in. I work hard when the boss isn't around because that's who I am, right? And so this, by the way, I'm about to go into my little, leadership stuff that I do. I've got this fucking deviate. Look what you did. I've got this little model I have. It's a battery. And on it, I've got the letters NGFE. And Gallup every year does a poll on employee engagement. Like how actively involved emotionally are they in their work? And every year, the average number is 70% are what I call NGFEers. You know what that is? Not get fired energy. And what is not get fired energy? Tony, you ever have someone work for you back in the day that was a not get fired energy person? How hard did they work? Just hard enough, just to get by. And see, if you're a Christian, if you name Christ, what's sad about that is 70% of America operates out of NGFE in the workplace. How many of those you think are people who name Christ as their Lord? See? And yet they go to work and they dog it. And they do sloppy work. And they don't go above and beyond to let their light shine on a hill, to let people see that this person is dedicated. Right? And so we have to truly work as unto the Lord. This is a principle that I stunk at early on. Even after I became a believer early on, I still got fired from 3 jobs. It wasn't until I got discipled. I was 21 years old and I got discipled my senior year in college that this guy got into my life. And he let me know in no uncertain terms after he earned the right that God wants more of you, Walter. He wants your heart. And I was just mediocre. Anyway. 5 jobs I got fired from. My first 5 jobs. Okay, I already told you all that. So, whatever you do, here we go, verse 20. Whatever you do it from what? The heart. Here it is. This isn't a religion, right? It's not simply religio. Religio means to bind, rules. This isn't a set of rules. You guys ever grow up in a church or a faith background that was rules?
Yes.
Yeah. There's no joy in it. It's nothing but guilt. And am I doing enough? And feeling bad if I don't. And as you get older, you just despise it. You just feel guilty all the time. And Paul's making the point, no, whatever you do, don't do it simply to be obedient. Do it from the heart. It's revolutionary here, totally revolutionary. He says, do it from the heart as something done for the Lord and not for people, knowing that you will receive the reward of an inheritance from the Lord. You serve the Lord Christ. Augustine, when the Roman Empire was beginning to crumble, Augustine wrote his famous book, The City of God. Right? And it is a tome. And in this, he talks about this idea of the city of man and the city of God. And the city of God is the eternal city. The city of man is the world we live in. And he had a word for that. He called it the saeculum. We kind of get the idea of the secular world down here, right? And then up here, it was the religio. It was religion. But what Augustine showed was that religion is a rules-based organization is what it is. That's a religion. It's a rule-based organization that revolves around deities. Relationship, the Christianity, was not a religio in the sense it was rule-based. It was rule-based, but it was driven by what? By the relationship of one's heart to the Lord for what He has done. How often do you see in your New Testament God's love for us and therefore our reciprocal love for Him? Right? Not simply because of what He did for us, but because we love Him. Not just that we love what He did for us, but we love Him. Right? That's the root of this thing. It's our heart. We do this from our heart. Something done for the Lord. Verse 25, for the wrongdoer will be paid back for whatever wrong he has done, and there is no favoritism, right? This is Galatians 6. Do not be deceived. God is not mocked. What? If you sow to the flesh, what? You will reap to the flesh, right? Destruction. If you sow to the Spirit, you'll reap life. Listen, this is a basic principle, a law of life. You can't get away from it. He says, listen, don't think people are going to get away with it. That person who's lazy, that's working by your side every day, that you wonder, hey, why do I got to give 100% when Jack over here is doing 60%, then the boss shows up and he looks like a shining star, but then he's lazy again whenever he leaves. That's no fair. Well, you know what's happening? Jack is becoming a lazy person. And over time, Jack is becoming somebody that he's going to pay a price in his life because he's not developing what? His character. He's not developing his heart and his character and his values, and that will show up. And Paul's saying, listen, all this stuff gets discovered eventually. All this stuff gets found out. You can't go cheap in life. You got to give your best, and when you give your best, the dividends of the best will flow from that. And if you go cheap, it'll be found out. There is a divine recompense in one sense, right? There is a justice in this world, the way it works, right? It's just how it works. So he says, listen, quick, get your eyes off of everyone else. Well, yeah, but they're not, and he doesn't, and she doesn't. No, do everything you do as unto the Lord. Because Colossians 3:4 says, what is Christ? He is our what? Colossians 3:4, remember? I think it's 3:4. When Christ, who what? He's your life. You're not my life. You're not my life. He's my life. And so I go through my days and I seek to do everything worthily unto Him for my love for Him. So whether I'm a husband, a wife, an employee, an employer, right, slave, master, whatever context this is, a child, I do everything unto Christ because He is my life. See my point? Beautiful section right here. It ties in a very practical way. It ties the entire social order here tied to the person of who Christ is. Not just what He did, but who He is. Do y'all understand that distinction? This isn't a transactional, because I do hear this a lot, because God did this for me, therefore I need to do this for God. It's not a transaction. God did this for me because of who God is. See? And that's what I love, right? My love for Stacy isn't just because of what she does for me. What she does for me is because of what? Who she is. And I love that. Not simply I don't love back because of what she does to love me. That's the point. I love her. And we love God. We love Christ for the same, for the beauty of His person. Okay? That is the difference here. Whereas if you look at religion, the binding of the rules, it is the great exchange. It's the great exchange. And many times you just hope you've transacted enough on your end. You just hope, right? And when you talk to somebody and say, do you think that when you die, do you know you're going to go to heaven? Oh, I don't know. I can only hope. Why? I don't know if I've done enough. Such a common response in the religions of the world. Whereas within Christ, what can we say? I know, right? I can have the assurance of my salvation. Because it's not based on the transaction. It's based on the fact that my heart has consented to the beauty of this person, this Christ figure, right? And He's so beautiful and He's so worthy that I consent and give my life to Him in every direction of my social world. I think that's great. I think that's great. Next week, we're going to be kind of going one more on the social order and the way that we treat each other, but that's not today.